I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be looking at Puritan settlement in New England and describing their perfect city upon a hill. So here's our basic objectives for today. Take a moment and pause and take note of them, and then we'll dive right in. So, as we talked about in previous lessons, the Puritans were not the first settlers in the northern parts of the North American continent. Previous to this, the Plymouth colony had been established by the Pilgrims, and so hopefully we remember the Pilgrims having left England, searching for a place to worship freely. They were going for Virginia, but instead settled up in Massachusetts. They struggled to survive, but were able to develop a military alliance with a group of Native Americans, which they then traded military support and technology in exchange for the basic necessities of survival. Over time, as the colony grew, there was some increased tension between Pilgrims and Native Americans, mostly because both sides somewhat wanted the same thing. Native Americans wanted to continue to live on their traditional lands, and the Pilgrims also wanted to find a place to live and to use that land. And so obviously, those two objectives being mutually exclusive is definitely going to lead to tension down the road. The Plymouth colony, as you can see there, is right on the edge of Cape Cod, and there's a variety of different Native American tribes. The Wampanoag people allied themselves with the Pilgrims, and as we start settling the Massachusetts Bay colony, they're going to be running into a whole bunch of different groups of Native Americans, especially as the population grows and they expand westward. The Massachusetts Bay colony itself comes out of the religious fights in the precursor to the English Civil War. As you hopefully remember from your world history class, Charles I was trying to standardize worship in the Anglican Church in England by imposing what's called the Book of Common Prayer across all of his kingdoms. This outraged a whole bunch of different groups of people. In Edinburgh, there was a massive riot when the bishop tried to read from this book because the Scottish were proud Presbyterians, and so the idea of an archbishop reading out of a standard Book of Common Prayer made them want to rip up the pews and start pummeling him with whatever they could grab. But for a lot of Puritans, they disliked this standardization as well, but instead of burning down the cathedral and throwing things at the bishops, they instead decided to emigrate and go over and join the Pilgrims and establish a community in which they could worship as they chose. This is the most famous sermon given on the ship as John Winthrop, the leader of the Puritans, was heading to New England, so pause and take this in. The key pieces here, of course, are the Puritans' religious vision, this idea of a city upon a hill, where they're going to live as a model community in order to both be an example to others, but also because they're Calvinists, so they believe in predestination. And of course, how do you tell if you're a member of the elect in a predestined society? Well, a member of the elect clearly behaves as a member of the elect would behave. And so by acting in a particular way, you prove your electness, and therefore the fact that God chose you at the beginning of time to go to heaven. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, as it was established, was just north of Plymouth Colony, whereas the Pilgrims came over in one scrappy ship called the Mayflower. The Puritans came over in far larger numbers. As you can see here, Puritans, the 15 ships, 1,000 Puritans showed up, and so whereas the Pilgrims needed to have positive relationships with Native Americans in order to survive, the Puritans were much more self-sufficient. And so we can clearly see that in the way that they view the Native Americans, not necessarily as needed allies, but instead savages living in the wilderness on the verge of starvation, apparently naked most of the time. This is the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it really illustrates the way the Puritans viewed the local Native Americans. Also central to Puritanism was the conversion narrative, and so all Puritans, all members of Puritan society needed to be educated so they could clearly explain the moment when they knew that God had chosen them to be one of the special members of the elect. So that's a key piece of Puritan society. As you can see here, the ships coming to New England came over mostly as family units. You can see a variety of different ages and a variety of different occupations. And so Puritan society is going to be relatively gender balanced with a wide range of different professions and ages. And so hopefully you can make some guesses as to how that would affect the structure and stability of their society going forward. These Puritan communities came over as we said, family units and kinship groups, and so each family generally established their own village, and as you can see here in the picture, They would establish a town hall, they'd establish a school, they'd establish a church, they'd have a house for the minister, there'd be individually owned family farms, and also some shared common pasture land in areas like that. Decisions were generally made communally through town hall meetings, where every member of Puritan society, anyone who was in good standing, who was clearly showing themselves to be a member of the elect, would get together and they would vote in order to make decisions. Pause and take in this primary source. Obviously, education was an important component of Puritan society, to the point where if you did not properly educate your children, obviously, one, they're not going to be a member of the elect, and so they're probably doomed to hell, but they could bring down the entire society if not enough Puritans were living in it, so therefore there was strict punishments for people who didn't properly educate their children. All of this helped build this image of Puritan society as a city upon a hill. Education was central to the whole process, making sure that students could read the Bible and could clearly articulate how they knew that they were going to be saved was an important piece. Puritan society did have some measure of separation of church and state, although some people tend to paint the Puritans as a theocratic society. In reality, although you did have to be a member of the church to hold political power, ministers themselves were generally not held as elected officials, and so there was some clear separation there. But at the same time, there were also harsh punishments for anyone who would violate the mores of Puritan society, because we can't have a bunch of sinners running around destroying our perfect city upon a hill. And so public punishments and shaming, putting people in the stocks, public whippings, and of course the famous Scarlet Letter was used to try to enforce proper behavior. Over time, there were differing opinions about what direction Puritan society should go. One of the people who chafed and fought with Puritan authorities was a guy named Roger Williams. Roger Williams had a series of radical ideas. One, that you should allow religious tolerance, which, if you had to, obviously the Puritans are not going to have any of that. The other radical idea he had was that the Native Americans were people, and we should be paying them for their land as opposed to just attacking and forcing them off. So, after a series of arguments with John Cotton, the leader or the governor of Massachusetts Bay, Roger Williams was eventually arrested, charged, tried, and then deported to a new colony, Rhode Island. Here we see some of Roger Williams' radical ideas, and hopefully as you read this, you can realize why the Puritans would not want to have any part of these type of crazy ideas. Rhode Island, where Roger Williams was exiled to, became somewhat of a haven for people who didn't fit into Puritan society. As you can see, it's just south of Massachusetts Bay. He purchased the land from Native Americans as opposed to seizing it, and as we said, it became a haven for people who did not want to live under the strict laws of Puritan society. Another person who fought with Puritan authorities was Anne Hutchinson. She was doubly threatening to the Puritan elite, to the established government, because she challenged Puritan authority and she was a woman. She was charged with holding Bible studies in her house and discussing scriptural ideas with mixed audiences of both men and women. John Winthrop, of course, was not going to have any of that. Anne Hutchinson refused to take back or to stop her preaching, and so clearly you can't live in this Puritan utopia anymore, and it's time for her to get exiled. She first moved to Rhode Island, but it turned out Rhode Island was progressive in some ways, but women having ideas and trying to be religious leaders, not okay with that, so she and her family moved out to New York, where she was killed in a Native American raid. She's since become one of the sort of images and one of the symbols of early women's rights movements, as one of the first American colonists who spoke out and challenged sort of the status quo of American society. Lastly, as the population of Massachusetts Bay grew, they expanded into some other areas. Puritans moved northward into what would eventually be New Hampshire, but also westward, down into the Connecticut River Valley. As they moved into Connecticut, they founded their own separate colony. It was somewhat more religiously tolerant in that everyone could vote, not just church members. The fundamental orders were also the first written constitution, so Connecticut had a series of codified laws establishing the rights and responsibilities. And their founder, Thomas Hooker, would also welcome in, of course, anyone who was not, who didn't fit in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unfortunately, the local Native Americans were not super happy with the fact that the Puritans were encroaching on their territory, and so in 1636, the Pequot War began. The Pequot were a group of Native Americans that, as you can see here, were just somewhat north of up along the Connecticut River. And so the Pequots struck against, there was a series of conflicts. Some settlers killed some Pequots killed some settlers, there was raiding on both sides, and then the Puritans got a relatively large army together. And here's the depiction of the quote-unquote battle at the Mystic River. So pause and take this one in. The major takeaway is that the Puritans and a group of native allies surrounded a fort at the Mystic River. They began to attack and assault the fort. The Pequots fought back, and so the Puritans decided to light the entire thing on fire. They burned the entire fort to the ground, killed any Native Americans who tried to escape, and wiped out the entire Pequot village. This was effective at both stopping the Pequots as being a military force that could resist Puritan encroachment, but also in terrifying the Puritans' native allies, who, after watching the brutality of the Puritans, decided that they wanted nothing more to do with these people and migrated as far away from them as they possibly could. So that's the beginning and founding of the New England colonies. Hopefully you can answer these objectives using the primary sources that we've seen, and we'll see you next time.